Prussia. The name invokes images of Bismarck, soldiers in dark blue uniforms with pointed helmets, and the Kaiser. How did the small, disjointed duchy become the nation that would unify Germany? The answer lies in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, and the ascension of Prince-Elector Frederick Wilhelm. Having witnessed the destruction of his nation, he set about not only to rebuild it, but to prevent the destruction of it again. He brought the nobles to heel. In exchange for their loyalty and 500,000 thalers to fund his new army, he gave them virtual autonomy on their estates and over their serfs. The nobles were the Junker class of Prussia. Over the next 200 years, they would cement themselves as the civil servants and military officers of the Prussian state. With the nobles content and his new army of 8,000 men, he set about using it. In 1655, Sweden invaded Poland. Fearing for his own nation's safety, he entered an alliance with Sweden. Frederick Wilhelm and his new army would get their trial by combat at Warsaw in 1656. After 3 days of bitter fighting, the Swedes and Brandenburgian armies stood victorious. The outcome of the battle and the war proved relatively immaterial to Brandenburg. What Warsaw did prove was that the Brandenburgian army could stand on an equal footing with the Swedish army, what historians considered to be one of the best in Europe at the time. Frederick Wilhelm's crowning achievement that would earn him the title the Great Elector would come in 1674. While Frederick Wilhelm and a majority of his army were fighting Louis XIV, Louis's ally, the Swedes, invaded from their Pomeranian territory with 20,000 troops. Frederick Wilhelm broke his winter quarters and marched 250 kilometers in 2 weeks. He launched a surprise attack on the city of Rathenow. With the capture of the city, Frederick Wilhelm cut the communication lines between the two Swedish camps in Brandenburg. The Swedish troops to the south of Rathenow were in the greatest danger of being isolated and set off to the north. The Swedish withdrawal was halted at the town of Fehrbellin. The bridge over the river had been destroyed, and the Swedes were forced to fight when 1,500 Brandenburger cavalry showed up. The commander of the Brandenburger cavalry immediately attacked the Swedish troops, even though he was not supposed to. By noon, the rest of the Brandenburg army had showed up with Frederick Wilhelm. The Elector's army quickly set up the artillery on some nearby hills. Along with another cavalry charge, this broke the Swedes and sent them fleeing into the countryside. Fehrbellin was not a major victory, but the significance lies in two different and yet subtle, the first being a defeat of a Swedish army. At the time, Sweden was considered to be one of the best military powers in Europe. The second being, much subtler, is the aggressiveness of the initial Brandenburger force. Frederick Wilhelm was 1688, leaving his son Frederick III as Elector of Brandenburg. Frederick III would become Frederick I, King in Prussia, on January 18, 1701, after agreeing to support the Pragmatic Sanction. In 1713, King Frederick Wilhelm I ascended to the throne. He would go down in history as the Soldier King, not due to his battlefield exploits like his grandfather, but for his fascination with the army. Over the course of his reign, he expanded the army and drilled it relentlessly. He also brought about an end to the lavish court life of his father and brought about strict rules governing the Prussian civil service. At the time of his death, Prussia began to take its modern form. It possessed an efficient, incorruptible, centralized bureaucracy and a full treasury. His son, Frederick II, would put this all to the test. In 1740, Frederick invaded the Austrian province of Silesia. Using the recent ascension of Maria Theresia to the Austrian throne as his justification, Frederick would fight 3 different wars over this province. Frederick's first major victory of his career would come at Hohenfreiburg during the Second Silesian War. Frederick happened upon the Austrian and Saxon camps and attacked. The Saxons, who deployed from their camp, were quickly routed. The Austrians, who camped to the south of the Saxons, were alerted to the Prussian attack and were able to deploy in a better fashion than the Saxon allies. The Austrian army finally broke after exchanging several close volleys with Prussian infantry and a final cavalry charge. This sent the Austrians out of Silesia, leaving the province solidly in Frederick's hands. Frederick's crowning achievements would come in two battles fought in relative quick succession, Rosbach and Leuthen. Rosbach happened by chance. In the days leading up to the battle, Frederick and the French and Austrian armies had been chasing each other, trying to gain an advantageous position on the other. Frederick lucked out and caught the Austrian and French troops on the march. The French and Austrians were shocked when the Prussian infantry showed up on their flank. They scattered after the Prussian cavalry charged them twice. After 90 minutes, 10,000 French and Austrian soldiers were killed or captured. Frederick's losses were less than 700. Rosbach not only ended France's willingness to fight Prussia during the 7 Years' War, but also broke the French army for the next 40 years. Frederick would crush the Austrians a month later at the small Silesian town of Leuthen. While on its way to its winter quarters, Austrians came to face Frederick's force of about 3,000, around half of what the Austrians had. The Austrian commander, who had seen Frederick off 6 months earlier at the Battle of Kolin, was quite unimpressed when he saw the Prussian columns march off to the south. Seeing this, the Austrian commander, Prince Charles of Lorraine, said, quote, "The good fellows are leaving. Let's let them go." End quote. The Prussians would reappear on Charles's left flank, sending his army fleeing. Leuthen expelled the Austrians from Silesia for good. Frederick the Great's victories, and even some of his defeats during his reign, built a myth around the Prussian army as one of invincibility. That no matter the odds, Prussia, somehow, would take the day. This myth would be shattered in a single day in 1806. After Frederick's death in 1786, his successors left the army unchanged. When Napoleon came to face two Prussian armies at Jena and Auerstedt, the battles were disastrous for Prussia. At Auerstedt, the larger of the two Prussian forces was defeated by one of Napoleon's marshals. Napoleon was off at Jena with the most of his troops. The feats were not only set about with military reforms in Prussia, but social ones as well. Prussia became the first state to have compulsory education. Serfdom was abolished. Prussia's Jewish population was formally emancipated and given citizenship. The military reformers fired or discharged most of the 142 generals in Prussian service, many of whom joined while Frederick the Great was king or shortly after. Set up the future Kriegsacademy and numerous other reforms. When Prussian and French troops faced each other again on the fields of Leipzig and Waterloo, it would be the French who were retreating. 1848 was a year of change and revolution. Not even Prussia was immune. In 1813, as Napoleon was retreating, the King of Prussia made a promise that Prussia would have a constitution. 35 years later, Prussia still had no constitution. The king just kept putting it off. The Constitution of 1848 and all its successors until about 1920 could best be described as a list of lies and shallow promises. The king's power remained near absolute. The entire government answered to him and him alone. And as we'll see later, the minister-president didn't really need parliament to get things done. Everything remained peaceful in Prussia until about 1862, when the country was on the verge of civil war due to a constitutional crisis. The king wanted money to expand the railroads, and the very liberal parliament said no, and that they wanted to cut the military budget. Desperate, the king sent for a Pomeranian Junker, whom he had sent to St. Petersburg as an ambassador for being too conservative. This Junker was Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck's take on the situation was that if there was no new budget, then just use the old one. For the next 5 years, the entire kingdom of Prussia ran on its 1861 budget, which is quite impressive when you consider that Prussia would fight 2 wars in that time, but these are stories for another time. After a quick war with Denmark and a final 7-week scuffle with Austria, the last pieces of the puzzle of German unification was the 4 southern German states. Bismarck goaded the French into a war. The result was the same as it had always been. The Prussians and their fellow Germans attacked aggressively and boldly. The Prussian generals marched to the sound of gunfire. Even when the French would inflict horrific casualties on the Germans, they found themselves running from the German onslaught. On January 18, 1871, as German artillery shelled a besieged Paris, the German Empire was proclaimed. This marks an end of our journey through the history of Prussia. as after this the histories of Prussia and Germany become closely intertwined. As a final note, read the following decree from the Allied Control Council. Quote, "The Prussian state, from the early days, had been the bearer of militarism and reaction in Germany, has de facto ceased to exist. Guided by the interests of preservation of peace and security of peoples, and with the desire to assume further reconstruction of political life in Germany on a democratic basis, the Control Council enacts as follows. Article 1. The Prussian state, with its central government and all its agencies, is abolished." End quote. It's almost poetic that a nation born and forged in the fires of war would meet its end at the end of one. If there was anything I could change, it would be the end of monarchy in Prussia in 1918. It has been theorized that if Wilhelm II or even his son was to remain on the throne, the rise of Nazism would not have happened as it did, as the absurd power that the president of the Weimar Republic had in our time would either reside with the king, or the powers of the president would be lessened at least. This would have prevented Hitler from merging the offices of Chancellor and President. This would hopefully prevent World War II and then therefore the dissolution of Prussia in 1947.